Today on 7th Circle Gaming, we explore the world of Arthurian legend in King Arthur, Knight's Tale, and we begin in our usual way with full disclosure. If you're interested in reading through all this, pause the video, otherwise, let's take a look at a couple of screenshots. Now, in our first screenshot, we like to illustrate what the game world looks like on its own, and what we're seeing is a medieval high fantasy looking world. Obviously, we can't see the high fantasy elements here, but of course there are going to be magic and wizards and elves and things later on. However, right now what we can see is that the characters are located on the top left-hand corner of the screen. The mini-map is located on the top right in its usual place, and the quest log is also located on the top right, not an entirely unusual place for the quest log, giving the majority of the visual play space over to displaying the in-game world. In our second screenshot, what we're looking at is the overworld of King Arthur Knight's Tale. What we see is that the user interface is fairly centered around the lower 1/3 or 1/4 of the screen, and anything that isn't on the lower portion of the screen is around the edges of the screen, again leaving the majority of the play space available for displaying the in-game world, which doesn't appear to be related to any real location, but it does illustrate that there are a specific number of locations throughout the in-game world that players will be interacting with, either through quests or sort of city building aspect to the game. With that, we're going to move right along to our next screenshot, which is one of the major portions of the game, which is the battle interface. What we're looking at here is the deployment phase, not necessarily too unfamiliar to players that are already invested into the turn-based tactics gameplay, so we won't say a whole lot about this. The combat interface is fairly self-explanatory and doesn't need a lot of explanation. So now, next screenshot, we're going to be illustrating one of the other major portions of the game, which is the morality chart. Now, King Arthur Knight's Tale eschews the usual black and white morality for adding an additional two options, these either being a pre-Christian or pagan, if you prefer that word, or a pro-Christian morality. Now, what we have experienced in all of our evaluation sessions is that obtaining points in any one of these is particularly difficult. But they are available, and it is something of a more complex morality system than we typically see. So we thought we'd include that here. Moving on then to one section that players are going to pretty much expect, which is the inventory screen. Now here or players may prefer to call this the character sheet screen. One thing that we would add is that during a quest, there is no way of swapping items in between characters. The only time items can be moved between characters is from the base area, which is, as one might expect, Camelot. Here, though, we see a lot of different inventory items that can be moved around, and we see also the ability to unlock different skills. With that, let's move on to our next screenshot, which illustrates one of the major portions of the game. As we alluded to earlier when we were discussing the morality system, there's going to be a fair amount of conversation interludes or in-game cutscenes where players will be given the opportunity to interact with the non-player characters and their conversation options will either gain points in their good or Paragon options, or gain them points in Renegade, or Pagan, or Christianity. Now then, moving on, let's discuss our first chapter proper, which is immersion, as it always is. Now, here the game has earned a 7.5 out of 15. It's going to be presented in isometric perspective. We're looking at a medieval high fantasy world, which is something of a grimdark world, although it doesn't necessarily go as far as Warhammer fantasy battles, but it is something of a dark fantasy world. The game will obviously be attempting to utilize challenge to get players invested into the game world, mostly in the form of the squad-based combat and resource management aspects of the game. The game will also be utilizing player agency to get players invested into the in-game world. This is going to be in the form of inventory management, as we mentioned earlier, and managing character development, as well as their choices during those conversation interludes. The game will be attempting to utilize, and this is sounding like something of a broken record, statistics focus to get players invested into its in-game world, in that the in-game objects will have statistics attached for players to analyze and attempt to optimize. The game will also be attempting to utilize story to get players invested into its in-game world, in the sense that the events of the game are presented as something of part of a larger plot. Now there are some audio effects of the game in the game that are meant to add to the immersion, but in our evaluation sessions it sounded rather like somebody stepping on a bunch of flattened tin cans, and so it didn't add anything to our immersion, and so it hasn't been included. Now then, we do need to move on to difficulty, and here Knight's Tale has earned a 3 out of 15. The difficulty options are fairly basic and not overly well described, although they are significantly better than we have seen in some games. There is a significant amount of learning by doing in Knight's Tale. The tutorial is fairly brief, although it does have some sort of tooltips when players interact with a new option that they haven't seen before. The key commands are fairly permissive, with a fair amount of different ways of accomplishing the same goal. As an example, the player can move throughout the in-game world either through right-clicking on a specific point or by using the W, A, S, and D keys. As we said earlier, the game can be played either with a gamepad or keyboard and mouse. However, playing the game with a gamepad does require some adjustments in the settings menu and relearning the inputs. The user interface is fairly minimalistic, although especially with a gamepad, players may find that somewhat difficult to adjust to even after a period of adjustment. So then, let's move on to lasting appeal. And here, Knight's Tale has earned a 3.5 out of 15. It does lack any sort of mod support. There is DLC available for the game, however this largely is centered on the skirmish mode, or seems to be largely cosmetics. And there are 2 gameplay modes, or actually a total of 3 available. However, the third is only playable after the player has completed the main campaign quest. So realistically, there's only 2 gameplay modes. The game is a story-based game with some decision points, which offers players the opportunity to either retry on a different difficulty level or replay through the game and making different choices deliberately. The game, obviously, is a turn-based tactics game, can be played for any amount of time, as it's essentially paused, waiting for the player to interact with it. The game does make significant use of Arthurian legend, and players that are more familiar with Arthurian legend may gain more lasting appeal from it than players that are not. However, from our experience, it doesn't require necessarily a deep reading of books like Le Mot d'Arthur. Simply watching Monty Python and the Quest for the Holy Grail should be significant to understanding the Arthurian legend that the game makes use of. Now then, moving on to overall score. Here, Knight's Tale has earned a 4.66 out of 15. Although some players may find that they're interested in rounding that up to a 5 out of 15, and we wouldn't necessarily be against it. The game does rely significantly, as we just said, on familiarity with Arthurian legend. However, it is something of a surface level, largely just recognizing the names of specific characters. The control scheme is fairly reasonable with a mouse and keyboard, although as we said earlier, playing through the game with a gamepad does require adjusting the settings menu and relearning the inputs. The replay value may vary significantly between two different players. There is a fair amount of content on offer in Knight's Tale. It may appeal to turn-based combat fans, even if they are not necessarily overly familiar with Arthurian legend. Now, the game does embrace the notion of alternative conflict resolution, and that does require a little bit of a grain of salt, so be aware of that. But what we're referring to is the notion that combat isn't always the answer to a situation. Players may be able to resolve an encounter with bribery, diplomacy, or combat may be required. Now then, moving on, so let's have those grains of salt ready. Hope you haven't put those away, because we need them for both shoulders now. There is a significant amount of player self-immersion that may be required in the game. We would also add that the mini-campaign, which is significantly less based in the traditional Arthurian legend, we did find to be somewhat more interesting because it attempts to emulate the idea of one monster against 100 different normal enemies, in which the player plays as the monster. Finally, the game does avoid the trope of sudden reinforcements for the opposition forces, greatly extending gameplay or extending a particular quest. Something that we did find somewhat refreshing compared to other games that do embrace the idea of enemies suddenly, for want of a better word, teleporting in and at the end of the seeming end of a quest. And with that, we're going to end our quest and say thanks very much for watching all the way to the end if you did. And from 7th Circle Gaming, we look forward to seeing you on the next video, and goodbye.